when we publish the contemporary literature in translation, because that's the only medium we can use, because we are writing in Punjabi, and that's the only medium we can use to introduce our literature to the mainstream, and English is the medium. And this was published in 1977, and we tried to present writers who were writing here at that time: Gurcharan Rampuri, Ravinder Ravi, Surinder Tanchal, Ajmer Rode, Navtej Bharti, Jagdeep Brad, and some poets from India, Puran Singh, Mohan Singh, Amrita Pritam, Kartar Singh Dubal, because they are our tradition, they are our background, they are the major poets. And then after that, there's just, I don't know, maybe isolated or individual efforts are made, like Darshan Gill has published one of his poetry book, Ajmer Rode, and one person in Toronto, he published an anthology, Green Snow. And then in 1983, the Toronto Citation Review, they have started in Toronto. This is also, they are putting together all the ethnic writers' writings in this Toronto Citation Review, which is still publishing in Toronto. And they published one special issue on Punjabi literature. And the other effort, which is, the more I mention that, the more I feel embarrassed, is the modern Punjabi poetry, which included 55 poets. And I prepared during my 4 years creative writing studies at UBC. And then I submitted to one of the publishers here in Vancouver. They accepted it. We wrote the agreement. And then they got the 2-3 grants on that book, that anthology, that included 55 poets. And then after sitting on the book after 3, 4, 5, 6 years, they were very enthusiastic when they started it. But after that, the whole thing was dwindled. We don't know what happened. Maybe they quit publishing because they are no longer publishing the literary works. They are just publishing commercial things over there. So this is, if you would like to see this, I have this manuscript with me. I got it typeset again and make the Xerox copies if you would like to see. And also I have the ruined typeset from that press too, if you would like to see. I have the copy there too. But why I'm mentioning this? Because this was the effort which discouraged us so much. This was the first effort ever made here to put together all the ethnic writings here. But the treatment we got is very discouraging. So we are actually hoping to get ourselves published. Why we want to get ourselves published? Because that's the exchange of literature. We are in a multicultural society. We are living in a multicultural society, and we are an ethnic group. And we would like to. We are reading your works. We are reading English literature so far. So we would like that people should read us too. So that's so simple. So we can exchange. And also, that's a simple, reason why we would like to publish ourselves. And I think if we get the support from Writers Union of Canada or from other organizations like Courtney School of Writing, because they have encouraged last year and they have arranged a poetry reading under their school, and that was encouraging too. So that might be possible so that we can publish more literature and make possible to read for Ian Weddell our literature. Thank you very much.
We have told our story rather in detail, and also illustrates some of the problems we face as ethnic writers when we try to get out and we try to get published. That's quite difficult for us. Anyway, I'll just introduce very briefly what we intend to do next in this meeting. The agenda is very, very flexible. Just the main points we like to discuss. They are, as I think George already introduced, how can we be a part of the mainstream literature here? And we like to have opinions here, new ideas. like the meeting is kind of exploratory type. And then another point we like to discuss is uh, can we start any common projects in which, like, we can translate some of the English writings into Punjabi and some of the Punjabi writings into English jointly, like the English writer and Punjabi writer can both collaborate and produce a work, something like that. And another point, or problem we like to discuss is that if there is a possibility of having bilingual poetry readings, like we can have arrange a poetry reading in which we read Punjabi poetry and it's translated into English, and some English poems are read and we translate them into Punjabi. In fact, we have already done that type of reading before and it has been very successful. But we like to kind of continue or start them again. Now these are the 3-4 points we like to discuss. And when I was talking to George, he's kindly agreed to start, because George has been with creative writing for I would say quite long period, and now he heads the department, in fact, a department of creative writing, and he's quite well familiar with our writing, but he has gone through some of the writings in the form of translations. So maybe George can start, if he doesn't mind, and then we can just carry on from there.
Okay, do you want me to come up there, or?
Well,
My voice isn't particularly strong, but if you can hear me from here.
We would like to record it, so.
Right. Would like. When Esmer asked me to talk about this particular problem of entering the mainstream, what I suppose you have to realize is that it's almost every writer's problem. From the individual writer writing even in the language of the country that he's in, right up to the various groups connected to a particular form of writing, be it children's writers, be it non-fiction writers, and then the ethnic groups. Everything seems to come by stages as the groups identify themselves. For within the union, for example, I believe for a long time, in order to get the children's writers properly accepted and so on, that they had to press for their own identity, their own concerns, their own particular legal difficulties as children's writers and so on within the writers' union. The most recent kind of movement that has come has been for the non-fiction writers, to get the non-fiction writers to have the same kind of legitimacy as the general quote-unquote literary writers. That the non-fiction writers, it was as much an art as the literary art, and that they would become eligible. Everything wends toward money or toward status or toward accessibility, that they eventually would have access to Canada Council grants equally with the literary writers. So you're coming into part of something which is your own individual problem, your own individual concern, but it is also part of a historical widening of the Writers' Union of Canada, also of the whole nature of the cultural scene in Canada, for each of the groups to identify themselves and what their qualities are, and to present those qualities to the public. The perceptions or misconceptions that go along with being a member of a particular group are important. For example, the non-fiction writers would tend to be perceived as having access to more markets than any of the fiction writers. So there's a great resistance on the part of the fiction writers against the non-fiction writers, because look at all those magazines, the general circulation magazines, from the very scruffy to the very, very immaculate, all of them paying from anything up to thousands of dollars down to no dollars whatsoever. But nevertheless, the market seems for that very strong. Nevertheless, the non-fiction writers pressed their case and carried it through to its own conclusions. You're part of that stream of various groups who have something to offer, trying to find a way of offering it and getting a proper reward for offering it. One thing that you'll share with most writers is the terrible writer's fate of it's the least paid of all forms of words. If you're lawyers, those words and clauses will earn quite a bit more than writers. What I would like to, after having said that you're part of a stream of effort that each individual and group has to make, is come back to another point that one individual writer once made, and Surjit has broached this whole point, that it was John Gardner, who is now dead, he's the American novelist, but he said, what everybody more or less knows is that in order to get attention to your own writing, you edit your own magazine and you publish yourself. And that was his first step as an individual. That has to be one of the first steps that any individual or group has to take in order to get attention consistently, because you are makers of the written word. And the only way you can get real, continuous, regular distribution of the best of the work that's coming out from your writers is in some way to get it into print, into your own magazine, and begin on a regular basis to publish yourselves. Surjit showed the lovely issue of the Contemporary Literature in Translation. I should say a little bit about what happened to Andy Schroeder, who wrote to you from the island, couldn't be here today, was the editor of Contemporary Literature in Translation. What happened with Contemporary Literature in Translation, in some areas economical, is a little bit obscure, but in terms of policy within the Canada Council, I think that the balance of international work in translation as opposed to Canadian work in translation was the wrong way around. It ran into difficulty there. But when that magazine died, it left a gap which has partly been fulfilled by the magazine in Toronto, but not to the same extent or with the same energy. So there is actually a vacuum for a general magazine that would have the proper balance, that would very much suit the Canada Council plus multicultural, those basic funding sources of having, say, 60% Canadian work in translation as opposed to 40% international work. Always when one is working in translation, at least one has to link up to the language that each of the groups is working from and main writers in those languages, so that there is a comparative featuring of quality, so that you know this is among the best because it is the best from here is featured with the best from there. It's one of the aspects of the magazine that from time to time we do better than at other times. The magazine we have in the creative writing department, Prism International, sometimes we're less international, sometimes we're pushing to make it again more international than it has been for the past couple of years, but it has as one of its mandates the job of presenting the best work from Canada with the best work from abroad as we can get it. But that's one of my simple pieces of advice, is get access to the funding, which is very much there for you, and to get a magazine going. And that, then you get into the other, and this you can discuss out as to what language you use as the matrix for the magazine. Now, the battles between the language that was native to Ireland were fought a long, long time ago and lost or won or whatever. between English and Irish or Gaelic. But one of the inevitable things, I think, and this is one point of view one of the great difficulties I feel, both politically, both in terms of strategically, that you'll run into if you produce a magazine that doesn't work off a matrix of English as a large base for it, that you will restrict its readership. I would like to I plunged that in very quickly, and it's I know it's one that'll stir up quite a bit, but I would like to also say something about a magazine that has a very cosmopolitan international scope. It's not in Canada. It's a magazine that comes out of London. It's called the London Magazine. One would think that being the London Magazine, it must be a very, very, very sort of home counties, England type thing that only publishes material from within range of London. Strangely enough, it's probably one of the most international magazines I know. The man who, it was all partly to do with the nature of the editor. This is another thing that I want to say. Not only do you need, if you're going to get into print, you also need an editor who has a very strong feeling for the range of things that exist. And this is very, very important. The magazine, the London Magazine, has an editor called Alan Ross. He has probably what is a legacy of the Commonwealth in him, in the days when the Commonwealth was, I suppose, an ideal rather than a leftover from empire. And he regularly features work from every corner of the English-speaking world, and with very particular affection from almost every corner of the Commonwealth, from Australia, India, New Zealand, every part, on a rotating, regular basis. And it makes it the most interesting magazine I have ever read, because what sometimes, even when the quality may be not, it is a monthly magazine, when the quality is not great, always the interest is there, and the item is either arguable over or otherwise. But he has a wonderful magazine. I think that the access that you have to various areas in the world where people are writing in Punjabi and about those other corners of the world give you, if you treat it that way, and if you use the English as the matrix to come back into, you have within your own particular ethnic group a great range and possibility of interesting items, because the language becomes not just a means to see narrow concerns. The language becomes, with the people who carry it in their mouths and use it and have got eyes in their head, it becomes the window to everywhere else with a very, very particular flavour and colouring added to that window. So my suggestion in becoming part of the mainstream is to realise that you are part of a mainstream of people in many, many parts of the world, and particularly here, and to use whatever filter, be it English in this case, that you can to get through it, get that whole feeling and tradition through to other people, and never to forget it. And one of the things that I would say again is that often we have our very, very tight artistic concerns, and the fight between the fiction writers and the non-fiction writers is partly a very important one, because what is happening elsewhere, I'm not talking about political writing, I'm talking also about non-fiction writing, which is coloured by the personality of the writer. That kind of writing is very, very important to attract general interest. Now, one of the things that I go back again to in what was said in George Parley's letter regarding trade publishing, is the trade publisher is somebody who just doesn't publish. It's not a historical group who publishes, let's say, historical books on the Second World War. George Parley was mentioning that one of the greatest books written on the Second World War, from a Canadian point of view, was published locally on the island by a particular publishing group associated with a very, very narrow interest. But the important thing for the Writers' Union and for the mainstream, which they represent, is that there are items in the magazine that are of general interest, and there you have access to those items through the good quality non-fiction magazine. And again, I would refer you to a magazine like the London Magazine that has consistent non-fiction magazines. And it has terrific gossiping as well as other things. It has some of the best people going at the moment in the world publishing there. Every big name you can think of. Rushdie and so on, they publish in the London Magazine. But some of the most gossipy items you've ever come across are in there. But they're also of interest. Now, from the level of the good, the best, the polished gossip, up to the very polished literature, if you can bring that range to your magazine, I feel that you'll reach the mainstream, because there isn't anybody anywhere who doesn't like to know what's going on with these people. And if you can make it attractive and interesting, you're already heading towards the mainstream. So with that, I think maybe I've said a little bit too much.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, George. That was great. I forgot to mention that George is also one of well-known novelists and poets in Canadian literature. That's why he knows ins and outs of the trade. Now, all I want to say is it's open, and I invite. Want to
Can you speak?
Pardon?
Can you speak?
Yeah, I think it's open and just very informal, and anybody likes to express. We would.
I want to respond to few of the concerns that Lord has.
Dr. Johnston has something very interesting.
My name is Navtej Bharti, and I'm a small publisher from London, Ontario. And I have some experience with the publishing of new writers. We are truly grateful that Writers Union of Canada has recognized ethnic writings as an important element in Canada. But we feel the recognition itself is not enough. Canada is officially multicultural society, and Canadian literature is being written in more than 2 languages. This Punjabi literature is a Canadian literature, and we would like to mainstream writers acknowledge this, that this literature, the Punjabi literature, Polish literature, Greek literature, Italian literature, Ukrainian literature, is a Canadian literature. It's not an ethnic thing. So, being a Canadian literature written in a different than an official language, we would like to have the access to the literary institutions or literary establishment as other Canadian, official, so-called official language literature have, because we are a Canadian literature. At this time, we feel that we are being discriminated systematically. For example, there's no provision in Canada Council for literature other than French or English. There are no grants for publishing ethnic literature. And I don't know about other provincial literary programs from various governments, but in Ontario we have the Ontario Arts Council. Some years ago, Ontario Arts Council had a provision for translation, grants for translation. They are no more there. So if we are a multicultural society, which we are, and if our literature is a Canadian literature, which it is, then this type of systematic discrimination, I would like to use this word, although it's quite a harsh word, shouldn't be there. And we we cannot expect much in a short time, but we would like to be recognized from the mainstream literary establishment that it is a Canadian literature, and being a Canadian literature, it deserves the access to various literary institutions as Canada Council, CBC, Canada League of Poets, membership in League of Poets, etc. Surjit has illustrated the frustration of a non or an ethnic book in its publication. This book was funded by Department of Multiculturalism. The publisher, I understand, had 2 grants on that book, and the book was an anthology of Canadian Punjabi writings, in addition with some of the writers from Punjab in India, Punjab and India. Why didn't we get that book published, even with the grants the publisher had? This is one of the examples. So we are, I agree that publishing is an individual effort, as George has pointed out. Every new writer has to struggle for her book to be published. It's a cutthroat competition in publication. But what we don't want the compromise in excellence. This is sometimes raised that the so-called ethnic writing sometimes are just shrugged off. They are just immigrant writers or migrant writers. We want to make it clear that we don't want to compromise with the excellence. But what we need access to various cultural and literary facilities and institutions. With this note, I'd like to end. Thank you very much.
Can I give a short little reply to this?
Sure.
One thing I'd like, I don't know whether I made it clear enough when I spoke. That's precisely what the Writers' Union is there for. It's the organ through which you press for. One of the big services that it does have for members is the legal support. It will undertake cases against publishers where writers have been unfairly treated, that their contracts have been broken. It has a legal service attached to it. That's one of the most important sides of it, that they will take up a case, that they will press it against a publisher who has not fulfilled a contract, that they will get some form of retribution for that, and the book published. So it's the more practical of the, let's say, of the organizations. I'm also a member of the League of Canadian Poets. The League, in terms of practicality, is not as effective, I would say, at this stage anyway, as the Writers' Union. But the Writers' Union is precisely there for that. And why I mentioned the non-fiction writers is because that was one of the big last fights that they had. The last thing that they pressed through, and Andy Schroeder again was the chairman of the Committee on the Public Lending Right, which was a legal thing. So what you have to do is become members, because that is the organ to do it through. And from what George has reported of the last meeting, is that there is the feeling that there is a place for ethnic writers in the union. If you can conduct yourself as well, if all the writers can conduct themselves as well as you can in English, I would press the case right through the middle of the Writers' Union. And that's my main suggestion. Get in there and push it.
Thank you. Thank you very much, John. Yes, we have discussed quite a bit in detail on this point. Somebody else wants to add anything? But otherwise we'll, okay, Sukhinder is a poet from London, Ontario.
let's say, few things. So if you can